Coming up next on Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, 100 watts of flaming USB, optical discs made of stone, building the cheapest PC possible, quiet PCs, SSDs, the Ultrabook drive, and yet another external GPU fail. It's all coming up next on Twitch.
Netcasts you love.
From people you trust.
This is Twitch.
Bandwidth for Twitch is provided by Cachefly at CACHEFLY.com.
This is Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware, episode 132, recorded August 11th, 2011. Flaming cables and optical discs made of stone.
This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Netflix. Watch thousands of TV episodes and movies on your PC, Mac, iPad, iPhone, or TV instantly. All streamed directly to you, saving you time, money, and hassle. For your free 30-day trial, go to netflix.com/twit. And by MailRoute. Businesses of every size use MailRoute. One user, 50,000 users, it doesn't matter. MailRoute will protect you from spam and viruses, simplify your life, and make your email usable again. Visit mailroute.info for more details.
Welcome to Twitch, This Week in Computer Hardware. I'm Patrick Norton, joined as always by the man, the myth, and if I'm not mistaken, actually at home legend, Mr. Ryan Shrout of PCPer.com.
I am actually at home 100% for at least another, 10 days or something like that. Actually, no, I take that back. Next week, I will be up in Petaluma doing both PC Perspective and This Week in Computer Hardware from the cottage. Nice. Potentially with you. Or not the cottage, I guess. The Twit Brick House.
The Brick House.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will. I actually am planning on coming up there. The legendary Twitch tequila, vodka, and cupcake and Diet Coke party has been delayed until your arrival next week. Should be very exciting or very messy. Hopefully we'll be out of there before the cleanup has to occur. Not that I don't enjoy cleaning up after messes. But
indeed.
If this is your first time at Twitch, Twitch is This Week in Computer Hardware. We talk about computers and technology from the hardware side of things. Not that we don't love software, but that we love hardware even more. And we should probably start with a post-mortem from your last adventure in Tejas. 42,000 hours of driving with a truck full of computers and giveaway toys. How'd it go at the workshop, man?
It actually went really, really well. We had over 1,100 attendees. Probably my favorite part of the event was going out before we let everybody in. We had this giant lineup of people outside the door that went snaked throughout the entirety of this giant kind of hotel convention area. It was pretty cool to see. A lot of people were very excited to get in. People were very excited when we started handing out prizes. That tends to be the case. And it was very cool. We got a lot of people coming up to the stage afterwards saying, hey, really love the podcast, love what you do. Thanks for getting about all this stuff. Watch you and Patrick on This Week in Computer Hardware. It was a really cool experience. This is the third time we've done it, and the response from the crowd has increased each and every time, right? So I think we had 600 at the first one and about 800 or 900 at the second one. And like I said, 1,100 or so, a little bit more than 1,100 at our second one, or our third one here, because there was standing room only in it, which was cool. And we had some good partners helping us out there, Corsair, NVIDIA, OCZ. Then, of course, we had Asus and MSI and Gigabyte, and all these companies donating hardware. We just passed out to hordes and hordes of people. Like Corsair gave us 50 of the USB, HSA, and HSA1 headsets, which nice. were pretty sweet, analog and USB versions. It was really cool. We had a lot of fun. And if you were out there, and I hope you enjoyed it, send us an email, send me an email, let me know what you guys thought about it, what we could do better, maybe anything like that. There were requests for maybe doing an episode of Twitch live there, something like that, maybe doing an episode of PC Perspective Podcast, something like that. And cool. Hopefully next year, if we get a little bit more lead time and something like that, a little bit more than 3 weeks, we might be able to make something like that happen. Because I think Brian Brushwood is actually in Dallas for that as well. I didn't get to see him, but I think he was there for a day or so. But it was actually very fun.
I will always fly to Texas if for no other reason than the barbecue. Not that I don't love the people. A lot of my favorite people are from Texas. But the barbecue is worth flying for. Intel is going nuts on the Ultrabook. The Ultrabook, big deal at CES. We talked about it last week. It looks like it's going to be a little higher than we'd like. But it's kind of funny. I'm looking at PCPro.com. Intel bets $300 million on their Ultrabook, i.e. next step broken leg. And you've got the lead graph here. Intel has this little platform they are attempting to push against the world known as the Ultrabook. Push against the world is not particularly a disguised way of saying Intel's pissed. Intel wants 11 to 17-inch ultra-thin, ultra-light notebooks to be running the Ultrabook platform. And it's interesting. Yeah, Intel, it's pretty. I think ugly is the word I'm looking for here, because as Intel is claiming the parts in an Ultrabook range from $475 to $700, which is expensive, like more than Apple expensive. This is, it's manufacturers claim that the bill of materials is around $1,000. And, Intel did what Intel does. For example, I can think of a certain mobile platform from several years ago that wasn't really technology, but was basically a branding campaign where you got to soak up some of Intel's incredible co-marketing dollars if you agreed to buy Intel's Wi-Fi adapters and chipsets to use in their notebooks. So $300 million to invest in technologies that further the Ultrabook platform. So is this actually going to be technology, or is this going to be $300 million to advertise Ultrabook in an attempt to take over the market? Oh, wait.
It's really tough to say, because it's worded in a way that it makes us believe that it's hardware and software improvements, right? So they mentioned specifically the overall goal of the fund, which will be invested over the next 3 to 4 years, is to create a cycle of innovation and system capabilities for this new growing category of mobile devices. So they mentioned specifically touch interfaces, longer battery life, enabling innovative physical designs and improved storage capacity. Leads us to believe that this money is really meant to encourage development of some unique features, not necessarily co-branding and marketing, things like that. I think if it were co-branding, marketing, there wouldn't have been this type of announcement, right? They wouldn't have said, hey, we're going to spend $300 million to try to shove Ultrabooks down your throat. They wouldn't tell us that, right? They would just do it, and we would believe them, and we would buy Ultrabooks. But the issue here is they want these companies, Asus, HP, Dell, they want these guys to really spend the time that they might not normally do to design interesting, good-looking, and innovative products in a way that Apple does, right? It's almost, you can almost say this is like an Intel and the PC world versus the Mac, because what they're doing is they're saying there's no reason why those guys have such improved. Yeah, right. I mean, it looks nice, right? We can do that. Just spend the time to do it. Here's maybe a fund with which to do that. It's
not even we can do that. It's like they're using our hardware. The MacBook Air, it's Intel hardware, people. It's an Intel motherboard. It's an Apple co-branded Intel motherboard, but it's an Intel chip. It's not like this is rocket surgery. Part of what I think part of what's been interesting about watching Apple is my understanding, has been bankrolling their manufacturers in China for the infrastructure investments when they want to move into a new when they want to integrate a new technology. So people in I can totally see Jonathan Ives and his engineers are in China, and they're like, we want you to be able to produce several million milled aluminum cases for our notebooks every year, and getting a blank stare from a guy like, we don't have that many mills, and the guy in the corner of the meeting going, cut you a check, right? And then all of a sudden, Apple is able to integrate a completely new form of construction or enable a completely new technology by financing the infrastructure it requires to produce that technology. Exactly. And this I can see. This is an interesting approach. It's like, the other thing that's so funny is the language. Like, to realize that vision, invest in companies building hardware and software technologies focused on enhancing how people interact with Ultrabooks, such as through sensors and touch, achieving all-day usage through longer battery life, enabling innovative physical designs and improved storage capacity. It's I don't really see.
We can translate this as through innovative sensors and touch. How about a glass multi-track touchpad? All-day usage through longer battery life. How about 7 to 8 hours with non-removable batteries? What about enabling innovative physical designs? Really thin, maybe really thin ones, right? Kind of MacBook Air-like.
Maybe shiny
improved storage
thin ones.
capacity, soldered on solid-state devices.
Well,
right?
part of it's...
Go ahead.
Oh, part of what amazes me is this is on one level this is so self-serving of Intel. On the other hand, like imagine if Intel could go to A123 and say, "We'll give you $100 million to give us a superior lithium-ion notebook battery," right? Or you know what I mean? Like I keep thinking like the problem with battery life is batteries because at this point we are at the point where the screen is becoming such a large percentage. The lighting of the screen is such a huge percentage of overall power consumption. We're looking at amazing power reductions in terms of, especially with SSDs, in terms of the drives and the main board and the CPU. GPU can start sucking some energies if you're doing 3D, but it's incredible to realize it's time. We need a good quantum leap in battery technology.
Absolutely.
Which Intel or Apple at this point. Apple's like flirting with Exxon as being like the most valuable company in the world. They've got a gigantic war chest. Somebody needs to sit down and start a skunk works to produce a better battery technology. I dream. Express card. This is like one of the things, I know you get this question. I know I get this question, which is like, why doesn't anybody make an external graphics adapter? One that I could plug into my notebook. And there kind of is one.
Well, there kind of is quite a few of them. Every year I go to CES or Computex and some other company, Gigabyte, MSI, ASUS, Dell, AMD, Alienware. I've all seen individual devices meant to do that exact thing. And the issue is they almost all use proprietary, very specific connection types and bandwidth and interface types that they claim are better than all the others. But what it comes down to is there's not one standard. And when there's not one standard, you get a lack of people actually wanting to buy these individual items. So you don't get the benefits of bulk purchasing, and so they kind of fall by the wayside. The most impressive one, the most interesting one I saw at CES came from AMD directly, and they were like, it was a custom design, but it only came in one model. It was an Acer Ferrari branded notebook, but they said, yeah, they're hoping to move this out to multiple machines in the coming time. It never happened, but it supported Eyefinity, it supported high enough bandwidth to do multi-display gaming and those types of things, which are really cool if you think about a box that always sits there. Come home, plug in your 11-inch, 13-inch laptop, connect that cable, and it uses your processing power inside of there, but you got your external GPU. I mean, there's a lot of benefits to it, and that's why everybody wants these items. I came across one from a company called Village Instruments called the ViDock, which has multiple iterations of one of them going as high as supporting up to 225-watt graphics cards, I believe, the ViDock 4 Plus. They all support dual-slot graphics cards. The issue kind of comes down to how they connect to the notebook computer. So they're using they're using express cards, which are basically through a PCMCIA type of connection, and the bandwidth is a potential issue there. You can think of, I think in this article that Jeremy posted, that the express card bandwidth that they were capable of using was about as much as 2 USB 3.0 ports or 1 USB 3.0 port unidirectional. So that's not really enough. That's not even really close to kind of single lane, quad lane PCI Express, which is kind of what we would want to see out of any kind of graphic solution. And it's probably good enough for some basic things. When we get into super high resolutions, super high frame buffer content, that might be a concern. But what was maybe more interesting than that is that they had announced, actually there was a story linked at the bottom of our news post to an Extreme Tech post that talks about external Thunderbolt graphics card for Macs, and that this company, Village Instruments, is playing with the idea of a Thunderbolt version of this. And I think that might have a much better chance of being a successful product, as long as it This all depends on Thunderbolt becoming a standard that's used on more than Mac machines, maybe a Thunderbolt across the entire line of Intel Ultrabooks. You know, maybe that could be one of these innovations that this $300 million fund type of thing goes to. And the ideas are pretty standard. The benefit of Thunderbolt, as we know it, is that it is a PCI Express interface. That's what Thunderbolt is. It has some other stuff wrapped around it, but at its core, it is extendable PCI Express bus that comes out of your PC. So I think there's a lot more capability for something like that. We're still talking about external power. So I had been sent both through Twitch and through the PC Perspective website some links to this Vidoc concoction that exists today. You can go on the website and you can buy it. I emailed them about trying to get one that we could test. Haven't heard anything back. I'm not sure if that's a positive or a negative yet. But I mean, if you look at the bandwidth, the highest end model they have is connecting to your system at a by one PCI Express 1.0 slot bandwidth, which is very, very minimal. And anything over than my impression is anything over a $50, $60 graphics card today is going to see a bottleneck from that bus interface. So the idea is that, yes, you can get an external dock that supports 225 watts. Therefore, you can get a 6850 or 6950 or something like that and attach it to any PC that has an express card slot. I think is going to be, they're going to be disappointed when they find the actual performance results. Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's almost doable.
Theory.
It's almost there. It's like,
it's so
always
close.
Almost there.
You can taste it, but it's not quite there. We're going to come back and talk about Thunderbolt's competitor stepping up, its competition in terms of, we'll talk about that in just 1 second right after we take a moment to thank our friends over at Netflix, one of the sponsors of today's podcast.
That's right. This episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is brought to you by Netflix. Netflix streams thousands of TV episodes and movies directly to you instantly, which means you save time, money, and hassle. There are several easy ways to instantly access streaming movies and TV shows with Netflix. You can watch Netflix movies and TV shows on your Mac or PC or iPad with the new iPad app. You can watch on your iPhone and some Android phones too, and of course, on your gaming console, Xbox 360, PlayStation 3, Nintendo Wii. You can watch Netflix instantly right on them and obviously on your TV that way. Even if you're not a gamer, you can get Netflix on your TV with the Apple TV or Roku box. There's other devices as well you can look into for that. With Netflix, you can watch movies and TV shows instantly using all of those, and you can begin watching a movie in one room or one location or one internet connection, really, and finish it on a different one. So it's kind of like having multi-room DVR, although you have multi-location DVR. Go to your office and finish it. If you're bored at work, just don't let your boss catch you, I guess, is one of the keys there. Whichever way you choose to access Netflix, you can watch as many movies and as TV shows as you want, anytime you want. You can cancel at any time if you're not happy with the service, but I think once you really get accustomed to the instant streaming services, you're really going to like it. Go to netflix.com/twit. You can try Netflix today for 30 days completely free. Be sure to use that URL when you sign up for your free trial, netflix.com/twit. We thank Netflix for their support of This Week in Computer Hardware, and we hope you enjoy watching instantly with Netflix.
Darn Skippy. I want to take a moment to remind everybody, so one of the people I work with here at Revision 3 on TechZilla is from Britain and is from London. And it's been an interesting week, obviously, for him because his hometown has been on fire in a really big way. But a couple of friends of his were visiting here in the States and got home a couple days ago to find out that their apartment building had basically been gutted and was in the process of being condemned because it was so damaged by rioters. And I bring that up because what's going on in London is awful, just as awful as a lot of the natural disasters we've seen in the last few months. So I want to remind everyone to back your precious data up and make sure you make a copy of it and back it up off-site. Because, whether you're in hurricane country or earthquake country or tornado country, or if you live in that weird little corner of Utah and Wyoming, which technically is the least likely part of the United States to suffer a natural disaster, you can still burn your house down or have your computer stolen. So back up your data off-site. Carbonite, any other online services, swapping hard drives with a friend, which may not work out too well in some natural disasters, but do yourself a favor, back your stuff up. In more cheerful news, I thought it was really interesting, especially in light of talking about the powering external cards and Thunderbolt being the big standard on the Mac, that the USB 3.0 promo group has decided to add a significant power bump to USB 3.0. They are talking about, Ars Technica was writing about this, the crew over at tested.com was writing about this, but essentially finishing a spec that puts the ability to deliver 100 watts of power over USB 3.0, which is enough to drive potentially monitors, it's just a really interesting idea. To finish the spec late 2011, start manufacturing what would be a radically different, I would assume, chipset and cable. Should be ready for RTM, ready for manufacturing in early 2012, which in theory, maybe, although I'm not holding my breath since Thunderbolt isn't on most of Intel's chipsets, in theory it could be ready for the 2012 chipsets. The guys that tested were commenting. But it's a really interesting idea. 100 watts is a huge amount of power for a cable. 100 watts is, that you could generate some heat. 100-watt light bulb will burn your hands. It won't light anything on fire without a lot of work. But I thought that was a really interesting idea that not only they're talking about like 5 gigabits per second, but bumping, like taking this minuscule, like 2.5 watts and bumping it up to 100 watts. It's just a huge, huge change.
Does it sound dangerous to anybody else?
I was having a thought of that because I got a system from Gateway about 1,000 years ago. Let's say like 95 or 96, and there was basically a multimedia acceleration card that was patched into the graphics card on that. This is back when like 2D acceleration was still actually something that was worth bothering to measure. Right. And the cable got switched around when the card got pulled out for photography. The cable got switched around, and it essentially shorted out. And, you're in a lab. We're in a closed lab with big glass doors and a pretty extensive fire extinguishing system, in the ceiling, and I see like glowing red, the sheath on the wire vaporizes. I see the glowing red wire inside. There's a puff of smoke, and I literally grab the thing and run out into the hallway before, because I don't know how much smoke is going to come out of this, but I grab the case, yank the power cable out, because power is what's causing the short and the heat, and get out into the hallway, so at least I won't be in the giant room full of literally probably about $75,000, $150,000 for the hardware at that point, because computers were a lot more expensive, but it was just this one wire that was jumped and burned out, but it was. And that was like barely 12 volts. That should have been maybe a couple watts of electricity. Yeah, 100 watts on an external cable, that's some pretty serious juice. So I'm curious what they're going to do. Like, I imagine, the switching of that 100 watts is going to be, it's probably going to be controlled based on what's plugged into it. I can see, some intelligence at both ends of the cable that allow the 100 watts to get switched on and switched off. Gotcha. I'm thinking like jumper cables to the motherboard, or using a riser card for the USB 3.0, because you're going to need a pretty healthy, I don't see Intel wanting to engineer 100 watts of power for anything other than the CPU or the GPUs on the motherboard. Or maybe at this point, Intel's so used to providing ridiculous amounts of electricity for CPUs and GPUs, another 100 watts through the motherboard is no big deal. But yeah, I thought that was a really, you're looking at like a 20 times. So actually going from like 5 watts to 100 watts. So, Ars Technica was writing about this as like a 20x increase in power available. Tested.com was talking about maybe powering external monitors, charged laptops. 5.25-inch drives or optical drives being self-powered becomes a possibility. And then you think about the fact that Thunderbolt isn't even particularly well adopted across Intel's chipsets, and I think we are going to have to wait and see what happens.
Indeed.
NVIDIA as a Project Maximus. Every time I hear Maximus, I keep thinking of the guy from Gladiator.
they come up with some cool names. Project Denver, I guess, sounds pretty cool too. Project Maximus a little bit more so. So this, it was either this week or it was last week. I believe it was this past week. SIGGRAPH is going on. This is kind of like the major graphics visualization conference in the world. And you usually, if you pay attention, you can see ideas and thoughts that are going to develop in the next 2 to 3 years and come to the consumer side of things and come to the professional world in a year or so. I saw some pretty cool demos on YouTube, just kind of hunting around for things today. This kind of stood out to me more from a professional user standpoint. This is something that small to medium-sized businesses would be interested in. There's two things: multi-GPU and cloud graphics. Both of them having different names. So multi-GPU, we know it already for gaming, and you can even use it for some professional cases. But what they're calling Project Maximus is NVIDIA opting to recommend a lower-end Quadro card and combining it with an almost infinitely scalable Tesla-powered cluster. The light Quadro card, so you think of like a $200 relatively inexpensive Quadro NVIDIA professional level graphics card, would handle all the graphics duties and displaying the desktop and applications output, while the attached Tesla processors would be responsible for handling all of the underlying computationally intense calculations. So one way to think about this is a render farm for small and medium-sized businesses. You have one Tesla supercomputing cluster in your office somewhere, and anybody that has a workstation that also has a Quadro graphics card, that's kind of like how they're making sure that you're buying all NVIDIA products, right? It can access the power of those GPUs, and you can even divide them up and allocate them to each user based on the power they need to get whatever their job done is. So this is kind of cool, and it's kind of a virtualization of local resources in a way that business users will be able to take advantage of this. And they say that HP and Adobe have already signed off, Autodesk, on these types of products. They really like the ideas, makes sense. I'll be curious to see how they handle any kind of latency issues or anything like that. But because we're talking about inside your local network, they should be pretty minimal. So that's what the Project Maximus is. The other one is virtual graphics, and this one's kind of the same idea, but going from the LAN to the WAN, essentially. Think of OnLive and what they do already with gaming. NVIDIA wants to do this with 3D rendering and allocation of resources. So again, just like you could allocate computing processing power on a per-user basis with like a local Tesla unit, which could be, they sell kind of external video card conglomerates that are just two. Now you've got servers and servers and servers of this hardware at some some co-location service somewhere. HP's building these boxes, and you can rent processing power from them and do this in real time. They're talking about pushing professional level graphics to mobile devices by using graphics card clusters based in the cloud to deliver much more graphical prowess than the mobile SoC graphics processors can provide alone. So that's it. It's kind of like OnLive, but instead of gaming, for professional 3D rendering, right? And here's an instance where I think that potential issue of latency that we always kind of bring up when we talk about OnLive is much less of a problem for the professional market. You're rendering, maybe you are rotating around a model of a car or a house or whatever it is you're building, right? But that 50 milliseconds, that 100 milliseconds delay that you might see in that is much less important compared to gaming, especially if we're talking about lowering the price of small and medium-sized businesses. So basically, you might be able in the future, if you need to, go into Amazon's, whatever they're going to call this service, EC3 or EC3D, right? And I just made that marketing name up for them. Then you rent, I want to borrow 1,000 stream processors for 10 hours a day for the next 4 weeks, right? And and they build you a pricing scheme based on that, and it's all divisible in that way. And so now NVIDIA, I think, that kind of stuff's already kind of in the works, but now NVIDIA's behind it, partnering with HP. They're going to make sure that the software infrastructure is there, completely compatible with the hardware infrastructure, and users are going to be able to take advantage of it as they see fit. So it's pretty cool. Just one of the things at SIGGRAPH that kind of stuck out.
I like it. I'm not waiting on having any personal need for it anytime soon, but when I do, I hope it will be there.
Nice.
So, no, you know what I mean? It's one of those things where it sounds really cool, but it's like, will I need it? Twitch at twit.tv, TWICH at twit.tv is the email address where you can contact Ryan and I. Of course, we're also on the Twitter at Ryan Shrout and at Patrick Norton. The braces are killing me. It's kind of funny. We got a question from Peter talking about a quiet gaming system, which made me laugh because I went into Central Computer to pick up a $6 USB cable because I didn't have time to wait for a $3 USB cable for Monoprice, and I found a stack of quiet PC fans, the Noctua, or as we say in Austria, Noctua NFS1TB, which is interesting because you start looking at these new fans. And if you're running them in sort of low noise or ultra low noise with the ultra low noise adapter, you're looking at like 6.2 dBs of noise or maxed out 18.1 decibels of noise. A somewhat more affordable, that's like a $33 fan. This is a $15 Antec True Quiet 120, which is supposed to run at 19.9 decibels at 1,000 RPM, 8.9 dB at 600 RPM. And then because, you know, stupid large fans amuse me, you have the Megaflow 200, which is actually bigger than my head.
Wow.
Or at least the packaging is, which is running at 700 RPM, moving 110 cubic feet per minute. Not a huge amount of air, I'd like to point out. And we are looking at, quote, 19 decibels of noise. So I think it'll be interesting. I have a potential case mod out of a vintage sort of rack mount case. I've been looking to build a case into for a long time. But so I've been thinking a lot about quiet PCs lately because I'm building up a quiet server for my home use on Texilla. But Peter writes in and says, hello, I'm thinking of putting together a new gaming machine, but I can't really decide what to get. NVIDIA versus Radeon, Intel versus AMD. The only things I know so far is I wanted to support 3 screens. I don't need any storage, really. I have access to a file server with about 12 terabytes of stuff. As for the machine itself, I want it to be quiet. I don't care if there's buttloads of fans. That's a highly technical term, Peter. Just that they can run on low speed but still keep the computer cool. I'm not sure how much noise water cooling generates. If it's quiet, that could be an option as well. I'm not asking for a detailed list, but something that could point me in the right direction would be nice. Best regards, Peter. And Peter has what I would like to affectionately call an extensive budget. He's looking to spend somewhere between 23,000 and 30,000 Swedish crowns, which translated into U.S. dollars is about $3,500 to $4,500. So price is no object.
Yeah.
And he usually goes for the, quote, second best thing on the market to get the most bang for your buck. And it's kind of funny, you know, what gets really interesting when you're looking at quiet PCs, you start looking at, you know, isolating noise, you know, choosing fans or water cooling technology that produces a minimal amount of noise to begin with, and then decoupling the noise from the hard drive from the case itself. Because a stock, inexpensive computer case, especially if it's built out of very thin steel, acts like a drum head. And anything that vibrates the case or shakes the case, the noise will be amplified by that big giant drum head that is the side of the case. It functions kind of like a speaker.
Right.
So, you know, do you want to start with talking about water cooling versus air cooling?
Yeah, so, I mean, so he has an almost, well, not an almost infinite budget, but he has a pretty high budget for somebody who's building a new computer. Water cooling, if you want the coolest or the quietest system, water cooling is the way to go. It allows you to move, you know, radiators to the outside of the system, make them very large, make the fans very large, like the ones Patrick has that are as big as his head, and thus move more air more slowly through them to cool them at, you know, you still have, you know, math you have to deal with here. You have to have so much airflow and cooling power. But I'm hesitant. I'm still hesitant today to recommend water cooling to somebody who's not up to the task of doing like this a big project, I guess.
Right.
And by water cooling, I mean like custom. You know, build your own water, build your own system. You know, get your own pump and reservoir and all that kind of stuff, and get the tubings and the fasteners, all that kind of thing. If you want to do easy water cooling, you can do those self-contained CPU and GPU water coolers that we have talked about forever on the show. Corsair has a new one, the H100, which is a dual 120 millimeter radiator one. So that's larger, should take up more space in your case. But you have 2 fans. In theory, you should be able to run them at much lower speeds.
Yeah, and that, I'd like to point out, like those are super convenient, especially if you don't, because water cooling, like Ryan just said, water cooling becomes a hobby in and of itself.
Yeah.
The less money you spend on water cooling, like the quietest case fan I ever had was literally the radiator and electric fan from like a Dodge minivan I picked up at a local junkyard.
Nice.
And I attached it to the outside of a case, had a water pump that had this big, thick, isolating material to keep the water pump from vibrating the case. And the only sound you could hear when you ran the fan at 5 volts instead of 12 volts, the fan spin considerably slower. But we had like, you're looking at having like 3 or 4 or 5 quarts of water in this, so it was enormously difficult to heat up the fluid inside of this, even with the CPU maxed out. But at 5 volts, the fan moved so slowly, the fan didn't make any noise, so all you could hear was the trickling of the water coming in and dropping into the top of the radiator, because there was no way for me to fill up the radiator high enough to make it a relatively closed system with no little water drop sound. So it was kind of like the zen of water cooling. But that was also like, I went out, I found a radiator and I mounted it to a case and I did all the plumbing on this thing. But water cooling, the smaller water cooling systems with the twin 120 millimeter fans, you're going to have to experiment with those, because out of the box, they are a little louder, I think, than you probably want in your quiet machine. I don't know. Do they sound particularly quiet? They just seem a little louder than I would classify as a quiet PC.
They're not silent, right? You're right. They're not. The fans on them are still spinning at what I consider to be a speed higher than necessary. You might be able to fan control that down some, but yeah, I mean they're not in the silent PC realm. No.
Okay. I mean, because a lot of it, I don't think Peter doesn't sound like wants to spend a lot of time experimenting with water cooling. What is kind of nice is we were talking about some of the new air coolers. For CPUs are impossibly quiet, like 1921 dB, even when running fast. And that's when you're talking about like noise thresholds in terms of dB levels. Like 40 is like the background noise of a typical office. 20 starts getting awfully damn silent if it's not 4 in the morning and you don't want to wake up. You know what I mean? Like you can hear the fan at 4 in the morning, but you're not going to hear it if the kids are awake or if the neighbors are active. I think the biggest challenge in terms of getting things quiet inside of the PC is probably the GPU coolers, and finding one that's not shrieking fan-like. You may have to play around with aftermarket fans for those. An enclosure can make a big difference. I just dropped in a link actually to some of Antec stuff, because it's interesting. Antec makes some really nice PCs. Basically, if you go into the Antec.com, dig around their website, and take a look at the Performance series and the Sonata series under the quiet computing listings, and the super sophisticated ones like the P193. But if you take a look at like the P183, they're doing some stuff with what they basically they're creating multiple layers. It's kind of like how car design has become really sophisticated, where they've started designing multiple layers in the paneling to help decouple, basically isolate the power supply noise and isolating the noise inside the machine. And there's aftermarket materials you can get that are like Dynamat for the inside of your car, where they're trying to reduce the amount of resonating on the surface of the machine and absorb noise. But Antec's got some really good quiet cases that'll help a lot with quieting things down, choosing the CPU fan, aftermarket GPU fans, water cooling if you're willing to put the time in to figure it out. If you don't need a large drive, an SSD drive basically means you've eliminated the hard drive noise. And at that point, if you go for, one of the higher end fanless power supplies, is there a good like 600 watt fanless power supply at this point?
Yeah, actually, I think we just published one. Let me see where to come up at.
Because that's one of the other places.
Yeah, I mean, there was one recently. I'll look later in the show and find the review of it. There was one that was fanless, that was passive, that actually came out with really good reviews too.
Silent Max MX5, because actually Silent PC Review just did a fanless PCU torture test roundup.
Yeah, I mean that's a great. We should point that out too. That's a great resource for individual components and that type of stuff, specifically to building quiet PCs, right? So definitely check out. So we got the Silencer series. No, I'm not seeing it right now. I will have to get back to you. But yeah, there are some passive ones. The problem is you're usually limited to a wattage rating of somewhere in like 500 range or below. When you're not,
which basically that's going to eliminate your dual GPU. Well, I guess you could do triple head off of a single ATI card and do it that way.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, if you want 3 displays, you can definitely do that.
It's actually really interesting. Seasonic X400 fanless, the Silverstone ST40 NF are the top 2 out of that fanless PSU torture test roundup. I do like the opening line of the silent PC review roundup of fanless power supply units. Quote, a computer with no moving parts remains the holy grail of silent computing.
Or close.
There are only two types of moving parts in a computer, disk drives and fans. And, solid state drives eliminate a major potential source of noise. Solid state fans aren't quite there yet. Yep. So I'm sure we've probably put everyone to sleep with. I occasionally go in and out of having quiet PC obsession. So I'm going to set down my quiet PC obsession now, and hopefully we've given Peter lots of ideas.
No shortage. We've got an email from Christopher looking at more SSD mayhem. He says, after sending you guys an email about SSD recommendations, I realized that there's a major difference between SATA 3 and SATA 6. With SATA 6, you can average up to 525 megabytes per second. With SATA 3, you average 280 megabytes per second. And this question is easily Googleable. I guess that's a word. But I look forward to hearing about it on your show. Are native SATA 6 drives backwards compatible with SATA 3 motherboards, i.e. the first gen X58? Thanks, guys. Once again, great show. That is absolutely 100% the fact. If you have a SATA 6 SSD, you can plug it into a SATA 3 port, and it will work up to the capability of the SATA 3 connection. They are backwards compatible that way. So if you do have an X58 motherboard, you can buy a SATA 6 SSD if you either find one on a good price, or you plan on taking this SSD with you on an upgrade to a motherboard or storage controller that does support SATA 6 gigabit per second speeds, then you have that capability as well. I think if we look at the prices of SATA 6 and SATA 3 SSDs, they more or less are pretty close now. And if that's the case where you're looking at prices, either a retail or an e-tail establishment, then I would recommend going with the SATA 6G stuff, if only because you are taking a step further towards future proofing, which is always important for PC builders. Was there a sub question here in our SSD email?
Well, he was wondering, he's currently running, I guess, a 32 gigabyte Patriot that is barely holds his operating system.
Yeah.
And he's like, I'm looking at Intel SSDs because I figured they are reliable, but I wouldn't pass up another known brand. If the price was right, maybe an Intel 320, because the Intel 710 SSDs are a little out of his price range. I think Intel's kind of set the gold standard for reliability. I know a lot of people that are pretty happy with the OCC Vertex drives, although we've also heard some people having reliability issues with those. I tell you what, honestly, if I were today and I had to build a system for myself and reliability was the key issue there, not pricing, not performance, it would probably be an Intel 320 SSD. So, and they're not priced insanely either, right? I mean, I think you put a link in here, 120 gigs for $210 at Newegg. So they're within reason of the other drives in the market. So Ted is in a tough spot. He says, hello, recently most of my things were stolen, which sucks, and is another good reason to back up your data off-site. I'm trying to set up a new build for as cheap as possible, as I don't have too much money to spare. Needs the entire PC, the monitor, etc. What I use it for: coding, gaming, web, normal stuff. Is there anything you can recommend? Is there any huge difference in AMD versus Intel? I'm looking to play the new games coming out over the next year and would like this unit to last as long as possible. It's how I try to make a living, so being computerless is really hurting. Thanks, Ted. If you're building a machine, any parts you can find used, whether you pick up a case for $5 at the local computer recycling center, or Goodwill, or Craigslist, or if you can get an older, I'd start basically like don't spend any money on the case. I'm a big fan. You've heard us talk about it 1,000 times. Buying refurbished monitors from the Dell outlet. Actually, they're not even refurbished. A lot of times they're not even open boxes. They're just returns. Basically, go with a 19-inch monitor. 19-inch monitors are getting down to around 100, 120 bucks. If you buy them online, you're not going to be paying sales tax, most likely where you are. AMD and Intel both make fantastic processors. I think at this point you're going to be looking probably for somewhere around 4 gigabytes of RAM and the least expensive motherboard CPU combo deal. You're going to skip an SSD. You're going to probably buy a 500 gigabyte to a terabyte hard drive. You're looking at sub $100 at this point. You can probably get a decent size. You can do a lot with a 500 gigabyte hard drive if you're not trying to store your entire movie collection. Right. At that point, you can actually get a decent performing spindle drive, for like $60 these days, and get somewhere between a half and a full terabyte of storage. Man, gaming, coding, web, normal stuff, that's all easy. Gaming is where things start to get expensive. They don't
have to be. I mean, they don't have to get real expensive. Not to toot our own horn again, but if you go to pcpro.com/leaderboard, you start with a $448 budget system that's a Core i3-2100, a full-size ATX motherboard, and a Radeon 5670 graphics card. And then we go into the other devices like the memory, and I think we did include a 1 terabyte hard drive for $60, right? So, I mean, these are pretty affordable parts, and if there's one place I would tell you to upgrade, it would be in the graphics card section, right? Because the processor is going to give you a lot of headroom for gaming, as well as coding and web surfing and all that kind of stuff. You're talking about a quad-core processor still. The 5670 is one of those things where it's right on the cusp of do we go up to an $80 card or a $90 card in our recommendations, but we try to keep this as low as possible. If he's trying to keep it as budget as possible, reusing parts is obviously the answer if you can find those types of things, cases, optical drives. But I mean, computers are. I just had somebody message me right as the show was starting. One of my friends from college is like, "Hey, Battlefield 3 is coming out. I want to build a system for this. What do you recommend?" And I sent him this link, and I said, if you want to spend $1,000, look at the mid-range system. If you want to spend less than that, look at the other ones. And if you want to spend a lot more money, obviously you can go higher. So, I mean, I think gaming is definitely increasing your cost because you can't go with integrated graphics necessarily. But I don't think it's going to do too bad to it. I mean, $150 graphics card is more than enough for a 1080p screen for most titles these days. I mean, we saw at QuakeCon, I saw Skyrim and Rage, both of which look awesome and are likely going to ask for a little bit more hardware if you want to turn up all the goodness to the maximum. But
one thing to think about is also the BioStar motherboard that's spec'd in the inexpensive system on the PCPro.com leaderboard does have integrated graphics. So if you are super crunched on a budget, what you could do is basically buy that, run it until you have some money to invest in a GPU, and then you'll have actually a pretty awesome foundation you can step up the GPU on for better 3D gaming performance. Just a thought.
Indeed.
Then you're down to like $420 plus $100 to $120 for a monitor. Operating system. OEM versions of operating systems are incredible. I'm just going to say that. Especially if you can buy
look for those
online. A lot of times you'll find incredible deals and legitimate deals online bundled with motherboards or CPU or other hardware components. My personal favorites being the ones where they sell you like a 50-cent USB cable or drive slot cover because they are required by the terms of their contract with Microsoft to sell a piece of hardware with their operating system. You also might think of, if money is super tight, you also might think about going open source and going with Ubuntu or another open source BSD or another open source operating system.
An option.
The Windows root.
Cool. Let's take a quick break here. We'll thank the second of our sponsors today before we go on any further. And we will let you know that this episode of This Week in Computer Hardware is also brought to you by MailRoute.info. MailRoute is a secure hosted service that provides enterprise-grade virus and spam filtering to companies of any size. One user, 50,000 users, it doesn't matter. MailRoute can and will protect you from spam and viruses, simplify your life, and make your email usable again. MailRoute is a secure hosted service that filters virus and spam of companies of any size, whether you're a single user or a company with tens of thousands of employees. MailRoute can eliminate viruses and spam, reduce the load on your email server, lower your costs, and make your email usable. Typical MailRoute customers see a 95% reduction in their inbound email volume, which is pretty dramatic, obviously, with virtually no false positives. Leo loves MailRoute. He's been using the service for his domains for more than 6 years, and MailRoute has been his top choice for spam and virus filtering all along. Tom Merritt started using MailRoute as well, and now he can use his email domains that he'd given up on as being hopeless. Tom Johnson, the founder and CEO of MailRoute, started one of the very first companies in this market back in 1998 called FrontBridge. It was acquired by Microsoft in 2005 and is still offered as the Microsoft Exchange hosted services line. Tom wasn't done, though, and had too many good ideas that he couldn't stand to go to waste, so he started MailRoute, his next-generation service for filtering email with a level of accuracy and a price that's unmatchable. The good news is there's nothing easier for mail filtering than MailRoute. There's no hardware or software to install. You just sign up with MailRoute, then change the MX records for your domain to start your mail flowing through them, through MailRoute. And then they do all the work for you. Visit mailroute.info to sign up. As a Twit listener, you'll receive a 10% discount for the life of your account, which is pretty sweet. Small business accounts start at $2 per user per month for 10 users. And because of demand from the Twit Army, MailRoute has added a new service for individual users as well. Less than $30 per day, or I'm sorry, less than $30 per user per year for single users. Visit mailroute.info and sign up with the email filtering service that Tom and Leo use. And we thank them for their support, of course, of This Week in Computer Hardware.
Woohoo!
Indeed. So how about an email about the good old bent pin syndrome from Mark? He says, I built a new rig a few months ago with an AMD Phenom 2 X6 1090T, a sweet 6-core processor, with an Asus Crosshair 4 Formula 890FX with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 2 Sapphire 6950 motherboards, graphics cards, and Crossfire. I was using the stock fan and kept running into overheating issues, so I got an aftermarket fan. While removing the stock fan and heatsink, it pulled the processor out of the socket and bent 3 pins a few degrees, enough so it wouldn't fit in the socket anymore. You can imagine my shock when I saw the CPU still stuck to the bottom of the heatsink. I gently bent the 3 pins back, popped it back under the motherboard, slapped on a new CPU fan, and hoped for the best. It won't even post or get to the BIOS. Internet searching seems to suggest that bent pins usually result in the no post problem I'm getting. Is my CPU/motherboard dead? Should I just buy a new CPU or motherboard? P.S. I already sent the CPU back to AMD to have it checked. Should I even bother doing the same with the motherboard?
Oh, boy.
So I think this is something we've all done.
Yes.
Accidentally pull the processor out of a motherboard while the socket is still closed.
I had somebody actually, I think they sat on it.
Okay. All right.
Well, either that or they leaned on it, or somebody set a pile of books on it. Literally, the pins were bent on almost half the processor. It was one of the most frustrating things I've ever dealt with, because the person was adamant that it needed to be fixed and not replaced. Right. If I'd been billing them, it would have probably cost, in terms of like the number of hours it took. 3 pins, a few degrees is, you know, I'm surprised that it wouldn't post or get to the BIOS.
I'm actually surprised with that too. I remember bending pins quite frequently, unfortunately, and just kind of using some little needle wires and bending them back into place and running them just fine. But I haven't done that in such a long time. I don't know if maybe the newer processors are more sensitive to it.
What I almost wonder is if in the process of pulling it out, they managed to, you know, if they got the pins out of one side of the CPU before the other, if for some reason that, you know, shorted the CPU out, or just created something. You know, I mean, if you bent pins usually are, you know, if bent pins outside of off the mother, bent pins with no power, usually you bend the pins back, and if they go into the sockets, everything's cool.
Right.
bent pins where you bend them really far and bend them back, and the leg of the little pin pops off the CPU, you're hosed. You're basically buying a new CPU. Bent pins, maybe, you know, if the machine was, you know, if the machine was on when you were removing the heatsink, which is wrong.
I don't think that's the case.
Yeah,
Right.
like, you know, that's the only thing I could think of. Like, there's no reason, like,
I can't imagine why the motherboard would be damaged.
yeah, or the chip for that matter.
But if I had to pick one for it not posting anymore, I would pick the processor.
Right.
I don't know why. I mean, maybe if it could have been something about the force of removing it, not that it's bent pin, but that there was a lot of force that were holding on to the pins when they pulled it out of the socket. So maybe one or more of the pins, even if they weren't bent, kind of got detached a little bit from the packaging on the processor itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's all. That's the only thing I could think of. I can't imagine it breaking the motherboard. I really can't. But
yeah, it's, you know, anything's possible.
Yeah.
You know, there are more things that are in your philosophy to really mangle a Shakespeare line. But yeah, it's the, you know, sometimes when we're working on computers, we get into weird little voodoo areas where stuff doesn't make sense, but it just happens that way. You know, if you know, hopefully, you know, AMD. You know, AMD will check it out and it's fine. And if it's fine, then it's your motherboard and buy a new motherboard. If it's not fine, probably buy a new CPU and motherboard, as painful as that might be with a fantastic AMD Phenom 2X6. Yeah, that'd be a real bummer. I'd also, just for fun, make sure all of the other components are seated and that you didn't accidentally like pull your power supply out and forget the power supply is disconnected. You know, everybody laughs at things like that, but sometimes it's really simple stuff that creates super big problems.
I can't tell you how many times I have taken RAM out of a system and put it back in, and everything just works.
Yeah, it's irritating when that happens.
Very much so.
Poppy says, which GPU is being used for transcoding? I'm an avid listener of your podcast. Thank you. And I've learned a lot from your episodes. We like to hear that. I recently purchased a Lenovo laptop with a Sandy Bridge i5 and an NVIDIA GT 520M with Optimus. I happen to do a lot of video transcoding, so I just wanted to ask if there's a way to know whether the heavy lifting is being done by the Intel QuickSync, the HD3000, or the discrete GPU. I'm not sure which of those options are the fastest. Hope to hear from you guys, and more power to your show. This is an interesting question.
So here, my issue with the question is he doesn't say what piece of software he's using. The one piece of software I know that could use all three of those is the Media Espresso software, which is kind of like the transcoding application that Intel provided to all the reviewers and kind of demonstrates the values of QuickSync and that type of thing. So the work will not be done by the HD3000, the integrated Intel graphics. It will either be done by QuickSync, or it will be done by the processor cores themselves, the x86 cores, or it will be done by the discrete GPU. So in my experience, when you actually are hitting the encode button, there will be an icon that comes up in the lower left-hand corner, and it'll show the Intel Core i5 logo if QuickSync is working. It'll show an NVIDIA logo if the NVIDIA GPU is working. It'll show an AMD logo if the AMD ATI GPU is working. And if it shows nothing, it tends to it tells me that the CPU is the one doing that. So that's kind of your indication in that piece of software. If you're using a different piece of software, most of the time they will indicate to you if a GPU is working. Now, it's not really going to tell you if that's QuickSync or NVIDIA. You could download an application like GPU-Z, and it has it will have an activity monitor for the graphics for the GPU. So if you select the NVIDIA GT 520M GPU in there and kind of watch how GPU utilization acts while that software is running, you can see if it's utilizing the GPU fully. You can also obviously use the CPU or the task manager in Windows to see how fully it's using processors in that respect. But there's no, if the software doesn't tell you, a lot of times it's kind of tricky on trying to figure out what it is. That's one of the headaches of my job of benchmarking things is I can get a lot of numbers, but then I have to make sure I'm double checking. Well, is this supposed to perform better than this? How are things kind of comparing back and forth between these different devices? So it can be a pain sometimes to figure it out.
And yeah, sometimes all you can do is kind of watch the GPU monitors and see which one's cranking up, or if it's if it's not cranking, if your CPU is remaining at 0 and a whole lot of encoding is being done, then my money is on the GPU as being
right.
the one that's doing the heavy lifting.
We want to do one more email from Tim.
Yeah,
right,
Tim. Go ahead.
I was going to say, Tim is asking about long-term storage. Says, hi, Ryan and Patrick. I have what may be a hard question to answer without being able to predict the future. Most questions, yeah, well, we'll see. I have clients who are in need of some serious data storage. Without being able to say why, they need an option for storing a few terabytes of data. But the tricky part is that it has to be reliable storage for 10 to 15 years, ideally 20 years. CDs, DVDs, and platter hard drives, I don't trust longer than 4 to 5 years. Is there anything on the market that will last that long beyond, in theory, or do you know of anything in the works that may solve this? Thanks, Tim.
So I went to a buddy of mine named Scott Moulton. He does data forensic. He does data recovery. He does some amazing education. I first saw one of his first things over at DEF CON, where he basically taught people how they salvage hard drives, how they recover data from hard drives that have died. And Scott spends a lot of time. Scott's a great guy when you're like, hey man, what brand of hard drive are you buying? Because he's going to tell you the one he's seeing the least of in his shop. Right. And so I asked him, I'm like, if you need to store data on something that lasts 20 years, what would you do? And he said M-Disk if it was available. Otherwise, we don't officially have anything that lasts. CD-ROMs have kept cold. Printed CDs, not much. And it's interesting, right? Because a lot of people are like, there are archival DVD and CD standards. They're essentially like gold archival DVDs. But essentially, any DVD that you record yourself, you are burning pits, the little bits that represent the information, into an organic dye, a substrate underneath the plastic. Some brands are better than others. Kodak, there's a couple of Japanese brands that are fantastic. But if you don't keep them cold, they will start to fade. They will have issues. There was a German computer enthusiast magazine that did some testing that they were shocked to discover huge amounts of data loss on burned CDs as little as 18 months after the initial session. The National Archives, right? You can do some interesting research up in the National Archives because they give advice. They basically, the National Archives is they are the keepers of the data. They're the ones that built the amazing system that takes the Constitution at the end of the day, the Constitution that's behind, like, the equivalent of sunglasses for paper, so people can walk by and see it, but at the end of the day, it gets pulled down into a vault, the likes of which is difficult to really describe. But the National Archives are basically saying 2 to 5 years for DVDs. Hard drives, you're like, I can put it on a hard drive. A hard drive will last forever, but hard drives for magnetic data, most of the high-end RAID systems or RAID-like systems out there I know of do what they call polishing the data or sort of renewing the data. There's lots of words for it, where they basically rewrite the data to the drives to make sure that the drives are magnetized. Because over time, the little, basically your bits are magnetic, positives and negatives on the drive, magnetic charges, and those start to fade over time if they aren't exercised. There used to be optical drives that were considered more stable, but the size of those, one, they're impossible to find, and two, the capacities in those are incredibly low. So Scott mentioned M-Disk, if it actually delivered. He's like, because he said he's got some, he's got some archive grade CD or DVD media. He's basically like, it has to be kept chilled. You have to make several copies. He's got some gold CDRs from 1985 that still works, but I think he's saying consider that the exception and not the rule. M-Disk is really interesting because it's a 4.7 gigabyte. It's essentially a DVD that's made out of rock. So
nice.
Yeah, it's really trippy, right? So MDisk says it contains no organic dyes. Instead, the MDisk data layer is comprised of a rock-like material known to last for centuries. Millenniada's M-Ready drive etches the MDisk's rock-like layer, creating a permanent physical data record that is immune to data rock. So on one hand, this sounds like the kind of thing you'd see. This reeks of the kind of thing you see a booth at CES, and then you never hear the product again, right? You know what I mean? And it's so... What's interesting, though, yeah, you know what I mean? Like, you had the same thought I had. So apparently they've had NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Testing, take a look at this. The idea is interesting. That essentially they are taking, essentially what we're talking about is carving pits into the surface of granite, right? You know what I mean? Like, this is like we're literally going to hammer our letters into the granite fascia of a building. In this case, though, the Navy, they were like, okay, the Naval Warfare Center at China Lake has looked at their technology. The NIST has looked at their technology. It's not available yet. So, you can pre-order the M-Ready technology. LG is going to be making the drives. I assume this is going to be an awfully powerful drive if they have a laser that can burn into this rock-like substance.
Yeah.
So I think it's going to be. I think it sounds wonderful. They're claiming the NIST says it's like it'll last 1,000 years because it's such a fantastic material that they've come up with. The reality is that nobody I've spoken to. My wife's a librarian. A friend of the family's is a librarian that works in digital archiving, this amazing poster collection at a major university. And most of the people I know who do serious long-term data storage, they have a process. They have multiple locations. They have multiple copies. They have, 20 years is forever in terms of computing. 20 years creates issues with data. Unless you're talking about pure text data, 20 years, what will the file format be accessible if you put it on like 100 thumb drives and hope that the data survives on the thumb drives? Will there still be USB slots available in 20 years? Well, you have to go to some guy in a back alley who's got a bunch of old Windows machines from 2011 in 2031 or 2020. You know what I mean? There are a number of challenges. You could put it all up on, on Amazon, or, you could put it up all on a Jungle Drive. You could put it all up on Carbonite. But then, of course, you need to probably create a legal document with lawyers that will actually check to make sure the data is still there and transfer it to a new service and monitor that data. There is no simple answer to the question. And this counts if you are archiving photos or if you were interviewing family members, if you have videos of Grandpa when he came home from Vietnam or Korea or World War II, and you want to archive this information, right? Because Super 8 films are falling apart. Old photographs degrade, especially if they've been improperly stored. Most people are improperly storing their photographs. There are a lot of issues to work out. National Archives is a good place to look at because they're always like, hey, keep it simple. Use standard formats. Don't use fancy compression codecs that sound really good at the time. Use stuff that's probably going to be supported. Keep an eye on MDisk to see whether or not it becomes a real product anytime soon. But I don't see a single answer to your question, Tim. I'd love to hear if anybody out in the Texzilla audience, the Twitch audience, my apologies.
All of the audience.
All of the audience is the PCPer.com audience.
Exactly.
Because it's funny, like, I can think of systems you could put in place that would include things like, you know what I mean? Like, but you need to either put in legal mechanisms and a trust to support them, or you need to sort of have this like family thing that's passed down. There's no simple like I'm gonna put I'm gonna put it on this disk and I'm gonna put this disk in this box that's gonna be buried for 20 years as time capsule. Yep. Because that's the other thing is you put it in a time capsule and you bury it. It's got to be something that'll actually survive being flooded with water, since that seems to be the big problem with the time capsules from 20 or 50 years ago, where they thought they had sealed the time capsule and they opened the time capsule and the time capsule is a swimming pool inside.
Oh, well.
So I just thought that was an interesting question, and I thought the MDisk thing was kind of, I just love the idea.
It's timely.
We're going to give you a disc made out of rock and a really strong laser that fits in a 5.25-inch drive bay. Speaking
it's pretty
of
cool, actually.
potentials for fires, yeah, I want to see that product exist. I just want it to be like 100 gigabytes on a disk and not 4.7. So Twitch, Twitch at twitch.tv is the email. We love your questions. You can also email at Patrick Norton or at Ryan Shrout. What's coming up on PCPro.com?
So we've been trying desperately to get this. We did a really cool interview with John Carmack at QuakeCon. It's about 35 minutes long, but if you've ever heard John Carmack talk, you get a lot of information in 35 minutes of speaking with him. So we're hopefully going to have that online by tomorrow, so people can enjoy that over the weekend.
Nice.
It's pretty interesting stuff. Anything, and obviously on TechZilla we have new things coming up as well.
Yeah, I'm working on a quiet PC build or kind of a quiet server build.
Cool.
Which is pretty exciting. I'm having the internal family debate because we're in the process of buying a house, which becomes a terrifying reality on Monday. So we're talking about, I'm talking about with some friends of mine. I haven't told my wife that I want to put in Cat 5, Cat 6, and fiber with the, trying to decide if fiber is worth putting in. We pull the fresh grounded wiring.
Right.
But a big one for us, looking at Pioneer's App Radio, which is their new iPhone sort of in-dash device for working with the iPhone. A pretty interesting head unit with big touch controls. And also looking at a roundup between the Roku 2, the Google Review, the Boxy Box, and some of what's going on with the Blu-ray players that have integrated streaming. So you have a bunch of people all of a sudden asking us, now that the Review has dropped in price, should I get a Roku 2? Should I get a Review? Or what are my other options out there? So we're going to be looking at that on HD Nation this week.
Cool.
So that's it for Twitch, ladies and gentlemen. This week in computer hardware, I am Patrick Norton.
I'm Ryan Shrout.
We'll talk to you next week on Twitch.